Hello, everyone, and welcome to NASM Live. My name is Steve Myers, and I'll be your host today. We have a very special guest and a dear friend to NASM and AFA here today, Jana Webb. She is the founder and creator of Joga. Hi, Jana, and thanks for being here.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm good. Just up here in the snow in Canada.
And we're down here in the sun in Arizona, so at the opposite ends of that continuum. Everyone tuning in, I'm sure, is interested to find out what Joga is. Catchy name. Lots of people think they know what it is, but we would love to hear from you what Joga is, how you created it, why you created it, and just kind of start to share your story with us.
Awesome. So Joga is my rendition of yoga that I've taken the last 15 years to create. It didn't happen overnight. It was never planned. But essentially, the original tagline was yoga for jocks. And what I did was took all of the things that I loved about yoga in terms of the breathing and the relaxation and hybrided it with what I understood about sport. I was an athlete growing up, and I had a tight body, I had tight hip flexors. And the first time that I ever did yoga, it was, one of those situations where I shouldn't have been doing it, or I pushed myself beyond the range of motion. I was that typical athlete, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that competitive athlete in yoga.
Yeah. And, and that's just, in terms of being an athlete, like we are very much coached to do whatever we're being told to do. Right. And so
100%.
If that yoga teacher was up there, like putting her, leg behind her head and standing on one finger, well, I was going to try it, and I was going to do it better than the person beside me. Right. And so
100%.
Right. And so what happened is I ended up, hurting myself. I hurt my back because I just didn't have that mobility to do those traditional yoga postures or movements. But I always say it was like a really bad relationship. I kept going back because there was things about it that at that point in my athletic journey that I hadn't learned in terms of the breathing and just this idea of being on a mat and not, moving or kicking the ball or doing anything. Right. So that part was, is why I kept going back. So anyway, so long story short is I loved everything about yoga in terms of the breathing and the relaxation, but I couldn't do the physical postures. And so I've kind of spent the last, 15 years of my life doing the best job that I could to bridge that gap between yoga and sport.
That's awesome. Yeah. Tell just a little bit about your education, Jana, where you studied, kind of your focus, and just what really drove you to get into sport, fitness, and everything, just beyond you being an athlete, of course.
Yeah, so I ended up actually going to Japan when I was, I guess this was after my first marketing job. I had, worked for Corona. I did all these amazing things. I had traveled Australia. I'd basically done a lot of things since the time I was 17 years old. I was going to go to college and play volleyball. But, at 17 years old, I couldn't choose my career at that point. There was too many options. I didn't know, like most people, right? Like, how do you do when you're 17 years old? And so I'm just a yes person. And so by the time from 17 to 24 years old, I just said yes to everything. And so I worked in marketing. I had my own company. Like I was running my own office at like 20 years old for an advertising company. And then I worked for Corona Canada. And then I ended up, and this is where this transition happened at, I guess it was 24 years old. I was in a baby car accident. And I was working for Corona Canada at the time. And I ended up having to quit my job because I had all this soft tissue damage. And then that was when everything shifted for me. And I remember I was watching Oprah at the time, and she was talking about aha moments. I don't know if you guys remember those, but I was like, this isn't mine, right? I was lying on my couch every day, like just watching TV. And I was like, what do I really want to do with my life? And at that time, my best friend was a dancer. And I grew up in a very small town in rural Alberta, which is west side of Canada. And she always came to school, and she was always so stoic and beautiful. And she was the dancer, and I was the jock. Like I had my sweatpants on, hair in a ponytail. But I did always want to dance and perform, but I just had never done it as a child. And so at 24 years old, when Oprah was talking about her haha moments, I was like, that's what I want to do. Like, I want to be a dancer, and I want to be on stage and perform and do all these things. And so I called her up and I was like, hey, buddy, I was like, what's that school that you went to, after we graduated?
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, it was the Randolph Academy. And it's a triple threat school. So it's singing, dancing, acting. And I was like, you know what? I think I might like apply. And she's like, oh, buddy. She's like, you have to like dance or like you have to know how to. And I was like, I'll go anyway. So I auditioned and they're like, well, what's your skill? Like, which one of the triple threats are you good at? And I was like, well, none of them, but that's why I'm going to school, because I want to
get good at all of them.
I want to do all of it, right? There you are. And so anyway, so I ended up I applied for the school and they let me in based on all these premises that I was going to have to do extra work, like extra singing tutorials, extra dancing. And given at the same time, I had just been in this little car accident. So I had all this soft tissue damage. So long story short is I started to see this lady named Glenda. She was my singing teacher. And I was still going to physio and doing all these things for this injury I had in my shoulder. And she started to notice all these restrictions when I was breathing. And she started to do all these moves with me at the wall. And it started to make me feel better. And I was like, what is this? And she's like, it's yoga. And I was like, what's yoga? I had no idea. This was many years ago. It was like 20 years ago, right? And so I started to go to her classes. I started to work with her one-on-one. And then that's kind of what fed me into this yoga world. But at that point, I was just doing these little positions with her. And then because I was a student at the time, I got like what would be called a Groupon now. I went to every single class I could possibly, go to for under $20. And I ran around to all these studios. And that's where I made this observation that regular yoga wasn't designed for people like me, right? And then I ended up graduating from school. I got a TV job right out of school. I did all these things. I kept my yoga practice up. And then I ended up in Japan. I got an opportunity over there to do something. And so something, it wasn't, it was to teach English. I was like, I had this TV show and I was like, this isn't what I want to do. There's got to be more to life than this, right? I was hosting this show. And so I ended up in Japan and I was craving yoga for my body. And so I found this only English speaking yoga class, like 2-hour train ride in Tokyo. And, that in itself was an adventure because I don't know if you've ever been to Japan or China before, but everything's in kanji and like the trains are very overwhelming. Anyways, so I take the train, I get to this yoga class. I'm so excited to do yoga. And I open the door and this lovely British lady's like, hello there. And I was like, oh, hi. And I was just so excited that somebody was speaking English, first of all.
Of course.
Because we do, I don't speak Japanese. And and she's like, the yoga class has been canceled today. And I was like, what do you mean canceled? And she's like, well,
I came 2 hours.
I came 2 hours, don't you know? And she's like, well, we're actually doing a certification for people to become yoga certified. I was like, oh, well, that sounds cool. How much is it? And it was like 7,500 yen, like something ridiculous, very expensive. And I signed up on the spot. And I was married at the time. Yeah, and my husband and I went there to like save money, you know what I mean, to buy a house and things. And I ended up signing up for this thing that was going to consume all of my time. But I will say that very first day I signed up, they gave me my manual. And there was a translator there, right? There was a Japanese lady and a translator. And the minute they started to like do these moves and say all these things, even though it was in Sanskrit, I had this like innate ability to basically be able to intake all of the information and be able to spit it out, regurgitate it, and teach it like that day. And that was that moment where I was like, I found my home, like I found where I'm supposed to be. I had no idea about Joga or eventually working with athletes, but all I knew is that I was designed to work with people's bodies. And I didn't know what that meant at that point. Yeah.
That's awesome. In all the times that we've talked and spent together, I never knew you actually graduated from the Randolph. I didn't know that.
Yeah, well,
we had talked about the joke of, your friend and her being all limber and, stoic. I've heard all of that stuff before, but I was like, when did she leave the school? And I was like, she actually graduated. We never ever talked about that.
I graduated and I did that double pirouette and I got in the main show at the end and I did it all, right? And so
no, totally, which is exactly who you are. I mean, everything that you have done has been pretty amazing, and what you have accomplished has definitely not been a road that's been paved by anybody else.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's awesome. What really led from there then? You figured out that was what you were meant to do. You wanted to work with people's bodies. What kind of came next?
Right. So we went back to Calgary, which is a city here in Canada. And, I think like anyone, when you get a new certification, right? I know lots of people are transition into personal training or health and wellness, and you're excited just to do it. Right. And so I was just looking for work as a yoga teacher anywhere. And I remember going down to the studio by my house, and I was so excited. I was like, I just got back from Japan. I've graduated. I've got this thing called Ishta Yoga. And like the lady who owns the studio literally looked me up and down, and she's like, yeah, we'll call you. And like slammed the door in my face. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that being a yoga teacher was going to be so challenging. Like, really? And at this point, you have to understand, I already had a huge advertising job. I was making a ton of money, right? Like at a very young age, and I was very successful at a very young age. So for this woman to tell me that I wasn't going to get a job in her studio kind of fueled some fire in me. So I was like, okay, I'll do it on my own. And so I made a little like sign. I rented some space at a community center, and I was like, yoga with Jana. And I just got like 5 people to sign up at a time. Like it's $5 a pop. And that's where I started to do my practice until I answered an ad in the paper, and they were looking for a yoga therapist at this place called Innovative Fitness, which was, like a boutique physio, personal training, wellness center. And so they're like, come in for the interview, and I got the job. And so that's really where my learning unveiled itself, in that I was surrounded by all these people that knew way more than me, right? And this is kind of been how I've presented myself to the world, is that I don't have a degree in, kinesiology. Like I don't have all these things that other people have, but what I've done is I've surrounded myself by really smart people, right? And done a lot of homework, in that if I didn't know, if somebody came in to see me and they had something wrong with their spine, or I didn't understand the words they were using, first of all, I would use my resources, right? And that job is where I learned everything, because I would see 10 to 12 people. I was like in a private studio where I just worked, you guys know, right? Hour after hour, just doing your time, right? And working with a whole bunch of different bodies. And then when somebody came to me and they had like an injury or they had something wrong, I was like, oh, I'm not trained in this. Like I didn't learn that in Japan. And so what I did was I Googled, right? I bought books, I asked people. And the biggest thing was I communicated with the people that I was talking to or that I was training. And that, I would say, is probably my biggest skill, is really getting people to tell you how they're feeling in the moves or in the positions or in the relaxation, or all the things that I was doing. And I gained a lot of information from that. So that was in Calgary. And then, there was a time there I was teaching at a yoga studio, and somebody called the yoga studio, and they were looking for a yoga teacher for the Stamps. So it was this guy named Brent Monson, who was the strength and conditioning coach for the Calgary Stampeders. And I remember, I think it was at the yoga studio or at Innovative Fitness, somewhere in there, someone said, hey, would you like to go and do this? And I was like, I'm a yes person. I was like, sure, I'll go do that. Right.
Will you share who the Calgary Stampeders are?
Yeah.
Just with everybody, so they know.
Yeah. So they're like, it's like our version of the NFL. So it's the Canadian Football League.
Fantastic.
So football team here up in Canada. That was in Calgary. Yeah. And that's where everything began in terms of the creation of Joga.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because I've heard this story, and it's an amazing story. And to be honest with you, at the end of this first session, you really had a choice. I feel like when I've heard it from you, is that you could have just decided, I didn't do this great, or you could have decided to do what you did. And so I just think that it would be really beneficial for the audience to hear what you decided to do and how you pivoted at this moment and made the most of it.
Yeah. So in this moment, I had all of these big football players. They're looking at me, I'm looking at them. And first of all, I didn't know even how to manage that. I didn't understand, even what my job was that day. I was just told to teach some yoga, right? And
you just said yes.
Yeah, I just said yes. And then it was like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what I'm doing. And this video is obviously a little bit years later when I knew what I was doing. But everyone like was talking. I didn't know how to manage the room. And then when I started to take them through the postures, I was like, these guys can't do this. Like they're like me when I first started doing yoga, right? And so it was in that moment. And to be honest, like that first session, in my opinion, failed miserably. Like they didn't know any different, right? But I did, because I could see them struggling and I could see the frustration on their face. I think a few guys just walked out, right? Like, gosh. I was like, but of course, because like athletes like to be good at what they're doing, right?
Of course.
And making them successful in those postures, it was hard for them because their bodies just don't move that way. And
Right.
that's when I had that like moment where I was like, oh my gosh, who's doing this? Like, I'm an athlete, who's bridging the gap between yoga and sport? And that's where this journey became, where I just invested everything. I had no idea what I was doing, right? I just was like, I'm going to keep saying yes. And I'm going to keep observing. I'm going to keep communicating with the athletes. And through that, this program started to unveil this thing called Joga, which is, not only the hybrid of science of breathing and relaxation, but I basically took this Eastern, thing called yoga with words like Virabhadrasana 2 and Vrikshasana and chakras, right? Like words that athletes didn't understand. I started to translate them, first of all, into a vocabulary that they understood so I could get them to, move, right?
Of course.
They don't know what Virabhadrasana 2 is. Like they're looking at me like, like, who are you talking to? Right.
Right. And with their packed schedules too, and with how much training they do, they're not really coming into these things with a learning or growth mindset. It's more of a help me get through this, help me feel the way I expect to feel so I can move on.
Exactly. And the thing that I've learned, and it's been highlighted in my career, is athletes, their time is so valuable because this is their job, right? And so it's not like somebody's just coming to a yoga class and they just wanted to like check out for the day. Like they're coming to this to be better or to recover. Like it's part of their training protocol. And that, has been a huge I guess learning curve for me, right? Is I love it so much, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to love it as much as I do. And so for them to love it, I had to change a lot of things, right? I had to, first of all, get them to understand what I was asking them to do. And then the second thing I had to do was I had to make the movements cohesive to how they were moving on the field, in the weight room, right? And so I always say this when I'm talking to like an NBA team or whoever I'm pitching to. I say to them, have you ever seen your athletes stop mid-court or mid-field and do a tree posture, right? And the answer is always no, right? Because athletes are never in that static position, right? And so what I started to understand is these athletes, there's a cadence to sport, right? There's always like 3 to 4 moves, and then there's like a pause, and then there's some sort of physical move or transition or play. And so, well, if I took that kind of understanding of what sport looks like on the field or on the ice or on basketball, and I just started to take these moves and just made the cadence match how they move, that was, where I started. And then I even took it one step further and started to finesse it into actual like biomechanical features of what I saw in sport, right? I would just be like, oh, when they stop and they jump and they catch the ball, like one leg is in flexion, one leg is in extension, and their spine's in rotation. Like, so understanding like that 3-dimensional plane, right? And then, taking these moves and evolving them into moves and positions that they were already doing. So then when I started to implement this into these sessions, they were more responsive because their bodies knew these positions. And like I said, athletes want to be successful, right? And so make them feel successful in their bodies.
Can you talk a little bit about the activation aspect of Joga? Because we've talked a lot about how it's yoga and for athletes and stuff like that. But really one of the big differences about Joga is that you are activated. You are not in this relaxed, slumped position. And then also I would love for you to share about the hand positioning, because in some of the photos we're showing here, we've got this hand position. This is not an accident. This is a very directed part of Joga. And can you just talk a little bit about how that connected to sport and how the athletes resonate with some of that verbiage and how you really explain to them what they're doing, where they go, and how that translates to how they're going to perform?
Yeah. And again, this has taken years to, be able to regurgitate this information, right, into like this program, because it's been through trial and error and learning from people around me. But what I, always talk about is like neuromuscular movement, right? And so Joga, we talk about like the human system and how we could get the most efficient result in the least amount of time. Because sometimes like I get told by a strength and conditioning coach, like you've got 10 minutes or you get 50 minutes or you've got 20 minutes. So it's really taken me like understanding, okay, what needs to go first, right? So I can get this result over here. And they're dictating what that result is, right? So if it's activation, I'm doing something different. If it's to get them into parasympathetic nerve and recovery mode, I'm doing something different, right? And so in that 15 or 20 minutes, it's taken me to understand the human system and how we can stack the systems of the body on top of one another to get the most proficient and efficient results. So for example, in Joga, we always start with breathing, right? To not only just to balance the left and the right brain and to get the body into a place of composure for balance and focus, but also just to warm up the lower and upper body in terms of neuromuscular movement, because most athletes are in rotational movements all of the time. So there's this understanding that you need to be able to separate your upper and lower body. And so if we can just start with breathing, belly and chest breathing, and isolate, then when we start to move into that transverse plane, that athlete is already prepared for that movement, right? And then we start talking about the circulatory system, like going up and down, and how then the blood flows on the circulatory system, and how we use the breath to bring more oxygen in, and how we get rid of CO2 on the exhale, right? But if the blood isn't moving, we're not getting an efficient result, right? And then the last piece through all of this, through movement, respiratory system, circulatory system, neuromuscular movement, all this stuff, then we just look at actual how we move, right? And Joga is very much about like the kinetic chain. And we talk a lot about foot to hand mechanics, because if you think about it, a quarterback, they plant their feet, right? They go to make a play, right? That kinetic energy is moving through their body. And the last thing they do is throw the ball, right? So with Joga, every little nuanced cue means something, like whether and we start from foot to hand, and whether that's a big toe cue, right, to get some sort of impact into the pelvis, right, for stabilization, whether it's one of our core cues to like stabilize the spine, or whether it's a cue from our hands to find that stabilization in the shoulder joint, right? But we work with the kinetic chain. We're very specific about joint purpose. And so, if the foot is a stabilizer, sometimes we just need to work there and work those intrinsic muscles of the stabilizer or of the foot, because if that foot's not doing its job and that athlete continues to throw that ball over and over again, and we have some sort of dysfunction along the kinetic chain, that's when we start to see overusage and injury, right? Because if the ankle's not mobile, if the knee's not stable, if the hip, right? So it's understanding kinetic chain, it's understanding joint functionality, and then it's understanding how then we can move kinetic energy through this body with more efficiency, knowing that our end game is always going to be either a performance gain or it's an injury prevention technique.
You brought up the cueing. You've also brought up the lack of success that athletes felt they had, or that you noticed they were having. We don't know if they felt it or not, but you were not satisfied with that. Share a little bit about the cueing system. I mean, I've experienced the cueing system. It's absolutely insane in Joga. It's super precise, but can you talk a little bit about how you actually readjusted the cues you used to meet the athlete's needs?
Yeah. And again, there's a lot of education there, right? And Joga really does expose weaknesses. And that's when I say, like, athletes, at first to get the buy-in's a little challenging, because again, they don't want to know where some do, right? But it's exposing weaknesses, because essentially what we're doing with Joga in terms of the strategy of the positions and the movements is we're fatiguing all the big muscle groups that are the primary movers, like the glutes and the quads. And then when we go into those static holds, which are very strategic and placed in very specific parts of the program, right, all of a sudden we've taken out all of those big muscle groups, and the athlete or the body is forced to use all those intrinsic stabilizers. So what this does for the coach, or for somebody like me coaching them, is it shows where those weaknesses are on the joint chain, or whether it's a lumbar stabilization issue, maybe it's a glute med like fire issue. But in our training program, that's what we talk about. We teach coaches what to look for in the athlete's body, right, to identify the weaknesses, so then they can use the program or talk to the strength and conditioning or physio or whatever to make it better, right? But the cueing system itself is, besides the foot to hand, is all based on the spine, the stabilization of the spine. Because if you think about it, if an athlete can find stabilization in any moment, right, whether they're getting hit, right, and they can have stabilization, or whether it's in a transition, right, and they can have stabilization. So our program, the magic of our program is in the cueing, and that every single cue we're lower, pelvic lumbar stabilization, right? And it's essential for these athletes because they can practice this in a safe spot on their mat. And what we talk about is repetition, just like their skills and drills, right? If I'm a hockey player and I've been like practicing my stick handling or my slap shot since I was 4 years old, right?
Yeah.
This just becomes a part of what I do. And
Yeah, the muscle memory.
The muscle memory. And I talk to athletes like that. I'm like, at first, like, you might not be good at this, but it's just like everything you start, right? You're not going to be good at it right away, but the more you do it, it embeds in your neuromuscular system. It becomes muscle memory. And then those intrinsic things that we're creating in the body translate into what you're doing, whether you're lifting weights in the gym, whether you're, making a play on the field. And that's the goal, right? Is to make these moves and everything that we're doing in terms of three-dimensional movement, embedded in their neuromuscular tissue. So it just translates into all of the other pieces of the puzzle. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
100%. Yeah. I guess I really wanted you to talk though a little bit too about the fact that you use body parts to cue and you do things like this, which really kind of erases the comparison or the I'm not so good at this, or it really just kind of serves the efficacy of the athlete.
Yes. Yeah. And this is a huge differential, right, between yoga and yoga. In yoga, they talk about like just, lift your heart, like open your heart center, right? And find your third eye. Like if I said that to an athlete, like they're literally looking around the room for their third eye, right? Like, where is it? And again, it's just, and it's not like there's anything wrong with that, right? Like athletes, like this is 20 years ago when we created this stuff, but we have to remember like athletes are in game mode all of the time, right? Yeah. And so if I use a language that says open your heart center, that translates into their brain into something like different than what we're trying to achieve in that moment, right? Athletes do hard things, and so athletes we need to be training them and working with them in a way, again, that is cohesive to their mindset, right? So if we open your heart center, right, then all of a sudden it's like, I'm in this challenging position and you just told me to open my heart center. No, this is hard. Like, tell me something else. Tell me something to stabilize my body. And so all of our cues with Joga are bone cues, which again is a way for people to, because if you say engage your core, like what does that mean?
Right.
So when
everybody may have a different, opinion of what their core is or an understanding of what it is.
Exactly. So we teach athletes very different way in many ways to engage their core, because you might do one thing, engage your core, and nothing happens, right? And so we use bone cueing, we use foot and hand mechanics a lot, to find that stabilization from pelvis to shoulder girdle and everything that happens between. And the other reason we use bone cueing is because if you think about it, you can visualize the skeleton in your body, right? And so if you say, draw your pubis bone in and draw your lower ribs to your back ribs, if you visualize a skeleton and the bones, somebody can actually visualize themselves doing that. Right. And if we understand fascia, right, like, and that whole, anterior fascia chain is connected to our three cues, which is the pubis bone, the ribs, and the sternum, right? And so we use those cues because we know that if we're trying to get a neuromuscular response, then that's the language we need to be talking in, because that's where that fascia attaches to, right?
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about language, because not only do you actually have to resonate with the athlete, but you have to get through other gates that are staged in any professional organization. So let's talk a little bit about that and kind of, like you mentioned already, you may have 10, 15 minutes. I feel like I've heard from you before that you kind of found your niche here by telling the S&Cs that you don't need to send your people out for yoga. You don't need to do all this. Let's bring this in-house. Let's incorporate it in. So let's just talk a little bit about how you did that. What it took, the struggles, the successes, because I know it's both, I remember you telling me that story of being out on the boat and missing the game and all.
I'm going to tell that story. It's coming. And I start this conversation by saying, again, like, I didn't know better, right? Like, I didn't know, first of all, what I needed to do to get into pro sports. I just knew at one point, like, that's where my passion was and that's what I wanted to do. And did I know how I was going to break those barriers? Absolutely not. But I'm a creative person and I'm always like very strategic. Like, my program's strategic, like my life is strategic. Everything is strategic. I learned that at a very young age. In terms of my marketing background, et cetera. And so, and it didn't change when I was like, okay, if my vision is to train that athlete or that team, how do I get there? Right. And so my very first opportunity was with this team. And I learned very quickly that my relationship with the strength and conditioning coach was very important, right? Because he's the one that opened that door for me. Right. And so I needed to first understand his job, right? For me to be able to sell what I was doing to him. And so I became very invested in all of the people in the ecosystem of sport. And I started to look at what the strength and conditioning coaches were doing and how they were training their athletes, right? So then I could better speak to what they were doing. And one thing I will say about pro sport is everyone's very guarded and protected because they've worked their butts off to get to where they are. So it's not like you're just going to hop in and be like, hey, I've got this thing. They're going to be like, who are you?
Yeah,
right?
Well, they also feel threatened too, because I mean, there's very, very limited positions within those organizations.
Absolutely. And so I learned to respect that very early on and not undermine, but more understand their job and their demands. And so again, that became about qualifying. And I say this a lot, like in terms of, the people you train, ask a lot of questions. And then when it came to me working in sports, I just needed to consume myself with everybody else's jobs by asking questions so I could understand what their day-to-day was and what their goals were, so I could piggyback on what their goals were, right? And so, for example, with this, what I learned eventually was like with a strength and conditioning coach, like their athletes need to lift a certain amount of weight. They need to be able to do a deadlift this way. And I was like, well, listen, if we can get a little more hamstring mobility in your athlete and a little bit more hip hinge, they could probably lift more weight. Right. And so so again, it came to me understanding very specifically how my program could make their program better, not replace it.
Just it's actually complement and fit into the ecosystem and actually supporting all the other professionals and other roles in there.
Absolutely. And then that led to, me working. And I learned this actually from an MBA strength and conditioning coach, Bill Burgos. And they were in Toronto. He was with Orlando Magic at the time. And we were sitting at the Ritz Hotel. I was about to train his athletes, and this would have been my first time ever working with his athletes, right? They're on the road. So it's important, right? Because they've got a game the next day and I need to know what I was doing. And he talked about periodization periods. I was like, what's that? But I'm being complete. Like, I'm not a strength and conditioning coach.
Right.
Like, I'm not like most of your NASAM, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like certified trainers at that time, right? Like, this is many years ago. And so I was like, oh, I need to learn this. Like, I need to understand like what this means. And so again, I was very honest with him. I was like, Bill, I need to understand what you're talking about. And he's like, well, if I let my athletes do your program right now, how are they going to be on the court tomorrow? Like, is it because again, it's understanding like the challenging part about yoga, and we kind of skipped over this, is like, and this is where the big challenge is that a lot of athletes will go to hot yoga or go to yoga just like I did and force myself and overextend, right? The muscles and the ligaments and the tendons around the joints. And they feel flat afterwards, right? They don't have the tightness around their biomechanics, power and speed. And so that's a huge learning curve for me, because they would do like a restorative yoga class or something, and they would be like, oh, I didn't feel like I had that power. And so I learned that very early on, and I used that to differentiate again what I was doing. I was like, we're not going to be holding postures, right? There's no heat. We're not going to overextend your, you know what I mean? Your ligaments and your tendons, etc. And so he was concerned about that, probably because, you know what I mean? He was probably like, oh, this is a yoga form and I don't want athletes loose on the court tomorrow, right? And so that's where the program was what it was. It was already fast twitch and whatever, but I really needed to, again, wrap my head around like what he was saying to me, right? And being very honest and being like, this is what I did. I was like, Bill, why don't I take you through the session so Right. And this has been a huge piece of my success is always, if you are going to hire me to work with your $25 million asset, I need you to feel it in your body first. So they could then articulate to their athlete, to their team, to the performance, head of performance, whatever it is, what I was going to be doing with that asset or with that person.
You also kind of honed in right there on something that you also provided value to the whole entire organization. And that was that they were traditionally just letting their athletes loose on any given day and telling them to go out and do something restorative or do something yoga based or stretching. And like you mentioned, that didn't always translate into what the S&C, the organization, the player, the coaches were expecting it to translate to on the court, the field. So to me, I feel like you've, again, filled this gap by bringing it in-house, letting the S&Cs experience it, working with them, and then really providing a service that fit exactly what they were hoping to get on that kind of you do whatever you want to do day.
Yeah. And, this again came to me, somebody, a strength and conditioning coach from I can't remember, one of the NHL teams. I was like in their city and I was like, hey, we've got this great program, it's yoga. And he's like, heck no, I don't want my athletes anywhere near yoga. And that's where it occurred to me. I was like, there's no governing body of yoga and sport. Right. And it's nobody's fault. It was just like yoga was trending, right? You've got like LeBron James doing it. You've got all these like athletes doing it, but there was nobody there to like the gatekeeper to say, this is safe for you. Don't go hot, like don't do hot yoga. Don't you do it? Maybe do this off season. Maybe don't do this before a game, right? So it occurred to me that there was this lack of education, right? And so it's like, well, this is where we need to live, right? We need to be the governing body of yoga and sport so that anybody that's going to, risk, right, giving their athlete the suggestion to go do this type of modality would at least know that yoga teacher, whoever that is in that movement space or strength and conditioning coach, whoever it was, would be safe. Right? Because we're always mitigating risk, right? I can't impact the player, right? I'm not taking that risk, that strength, you know what I mean? So we've really harnessed in on that. And we're there's this huge gap in the industry of pro sports, to be quite honest, where there is no government. They're just going to Google, just like I did, right? Like cheap yoga classes in the area, because I was a student at the time, right? And all these things pop up, And I always tell this story here about my son. My son is now 12 years old. And he's been playing hockey since he was 3. We're in Canada, so it's like football in the US, right? And maybe like 20 years old, he gets a scholarship to Harvard. This is mom's wish. And so Harvard, and he's like playing hockey, and the strength and conditioning coaches hear that yoga is good for recovery. So he's like, you know what? Well, you looked flat on the ice today. You should go do some yoga. So Will's like 20, he's never done yoga, and he just Googles yoga in Boston or wherever, right? And he just goes to a yoga class, right? And maybe that yoga teacher's just, they're doing their thing, right?
You have no idea.
They're just doing their thing. Yeah. And all of a sudden, Will's like holding a position for like a minute. And maybe it's hot yoga class, right? And then if you think about it, little Will, who's been doing all these skills and drills, right, since he was 3 years old, all of a sudden gets into this yoga studio where it's a completely different thing for his body, right? And then he goes on the ice the next day and maybe he like pulls something, right? Pulls a groin because he did, you know what I mean? He held that side lunge for too long, or he feels flat, because all of a sudden for 18 years, he was doing all of these things for his skills and drills, which required like proprioception and fast twitch and power and speed, to then at 20 to get thrown into this environment for his body that was completely foreign, right? Yeah. And this is the conversation that needs to happen between yoga and sport. Right? Like there really needs to be an education or an educator around this topic. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I always say that Joga gave up success where other companies would have never done so. I don't know if you just want to talk a little bit about that and how that was driven by your passion, but then also how that kind of fueled your success. Because I think a lot of our listeners out there may be new service professionals, maybe new to the fitness world, or they may be in a time of transition trying to think of where can I expand? How can I diversify? And, you kind of did the opposite, Jana, but what you talk about and the way you tell that story, to me is very meaningful, and there's a lot to be shared there with our other professionals. And I think that, you know, you've been talking a lot about it on the what you've done afterwards, the success you got with the S&Cs, you learned their language, you found the niche, you know, you did all this stuff, you kind of solved their problems with your solution, but you gave up stuff like a Joga house, like formats for the everyday person and other things like that. And I, you know, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about why you did that and then how that ended up really focusing you into where you are today.
Yeah. And, you know, when I was talking about like get clear on that end vision, right?
Yeah.
And get clear on that picture and what it looks like for you. You know, sometimes it has to be muddy first to be able to sift through that. Right. And what I mean by that is, you know, we get pulled or we get, you know, there's this magnifying glass around like, you know, making a bunch of money and going mainstream and doing all these things that you would think would breed success, right?
Right.
And then when you have business people and mentors and investors saying, you know, pro sports is such a limited market. Like if you took your program and took it mainstream, like think how much successful you could be and how much money you could make, right?
Right.
And so I went down that path, you know, and I took the investors' money and I built a Joga house and I built a studio, and it was a completely different market. You know, I thought the athletes, when they would come into Toronto, would come to my studio, but I should have known better because it's one more step in their day. They're not doing that.
Right. You got to go to them.
You got to go to them, right? I've always gone to them. It's always been a service business. And to be honest, as much as I tried to wrap my head around this, and I say this with the best intention, I wasn't passionate about, you know, training the Yorkville mom who just wanted her butt to look good for a bikini. Like it just wasn't where my passion was, you know, and it was really hard to be honest about that because there was a lot of money invested in this space, and I built this beautiful studio, and I closed it, and it just if you're not being authentic and you're doing something, and for some people that's the dream. I've got my days, I'm going to go I've got my clients, and I'm going to, you know, like just do group classes and train in some people, and that's amazing. It just wasn't where my passion was. And it's interesting because I think there's this whole voice about finding authenticity, and when we talk about being authentic and finding authenticity, like how do we do that, you know? And it is about trusting those little voices in your belly, and it is about doing the things where, you know, it's 10 o'clock at night and you're still working, and you're like, it feels like it's 9 o'clock in the morning, right?
Right.
Like those types of days happen for you. That's probably where you should be. You know what I mean?
For sure.
If it feels like work every single day and you're exhausted. I remember as a new yoga teacher running around with my mat, teaching corporate classes, driving. Sometimes I brought my 2-year-old in with me, like he's crying. I'm like, I'm trying to make $35 here, parking, running around, like just like ran myself ragged. You know what I mean? When I was first starting. And what you have to do, you know what I mean? You have to like try all these things. I tried to do the corporate thing. I tried to have the studio. I tried to do all these different things to come full circle to understand that's not what I'm doing. What I'm passionate about is watching an athlete that I've trained on the quarter of the field and just, you know, seeing how, you know, the program in terms of the breath and the relaxation, everything that we do, maybe it made a difference for them. You know what I mean? Maybe. And obviously in cohesiveness with everybody else that's working with that athlete or that team. But I was like, that's what I'm passionate about, right? Having my son's team do Joga, and like they win a championship in Montreal, you know, and we're doing Joga in their room, and they're like 12 years old and they're stoked and they win, you know, like
for sure.
It always goes back to the athlete. And so I, you know, and it's a hard lesson to learn. Most of the things I've learned have come with like huge ups and downs and lots of risk. Right? Because could have I made that studio worked and made a lot of money? 1,000%, right? But
well, it wasn't that it was unsuccessful. And I just remember when you told me you shut it down, like I wasn't sure how to respond. And so I responded the appropriate way. I was like, oh, Jana, I'm sorry to hear that. But then it was not that message from you at all. You were like, oh, Steve, this was the best day of my life.
Yeah.
Like this opened everything up. And to be honest with you, Jana, since that day and watching the success you've had since then on your journey, I mean, it's twofold, tenfold, whatever. I mean, it's night and day difference, black and white difference, whatever the analogy you want to use. I mean, Joga has been so successful since then. You've become such a happier person. You know, I mean, like every time I see you, you just are full of energy. And, you know, we spent 4 days together at Red Bull, and, you know, all 4 days was amazing. You know, so I agree. I agree with everything you did. I just remember thinking, as an outsider, oh geez, like this must be a really hard day for you. And you were like, oh God, this is the best day of my life.
Yeah, well, and it's just like the purpose became so crystal clear. And it is interesting because once you make that decision, I feel like the world kind of gives you everything that you need to move forward in that path. Like if you're trying things and they feel really hard all the time, it's probably not the right space or the right spot or, you know, the right time. Like I truly believe that the world gives you the things and the people and the experiences when you're ready for them, right? And so did I ever stop working through all this? Heck no. I'm the hardest worker. Like I work, you know, my dad's a farmer, like he taught me this, like you work and good things will happen. But there's also a difference of working really hard at something you don't like to do and just working because you love it so much that you can't, no days feel like work, right? And so it really was when we closed the studio and when that's when I really harnessed my program. And I was down with the Houston Rockets, and the head of performance down there gave me the biggest compliment ever. He did my certification. His whole team did my certification. And
there you are with some of the well-known Rockets.
And you know, and that was the physio in there. Like he made everyone do the program. So those athletes again that are worth, you know, a lot of money, like everybody in the team knew what we were doing. And that I would say with the Houston Rockets was my biggest like moment where I was like, I've got this, you know what I mean? If you know, the head of performance from the Houston Rockets, who works with one of the best NBA players in the world, is endorsing my product, right? And asking his athletes to do it, right? That was a game changer for me. And I'm forever grateful for Javar because he's one of these strength and conditioning coaches that has an open mind. And, you know, because there's some guys out there and girls that are just guarded and they're like, it's my athlete and whatever, but it's a completely wrong mindset. If your goal is actually to help that person, you're going to take you know, you got to obviously filter, but he took the time to understand this thing that I've spent 15 years built, you know what I mean? And did the certification just like you did. And so then he could say to his like to the players, this is why you need to do this, right? Or he could say to PT, AT, to physio, you know, hey, do this for prehab or whatever. So that was a game changer. Absolutely.
Since you brought up the Red Bull training and certification, you did something really amazing during that time. At least it was really amazing to me. I don't know if everybody else in the certification took notice of it. It's probably something you've naturally do, Jana, just because of your marketing background. But when we were at Red Bull, and this was this was late February, you guys probably the last time a lot of us traveled or did anything in person in 2020. But we had, Red Bull had what, you know, we believe to be the Olympic gold medal prospect in fencing there. And he was recovering from injuries. And you did a little kind of what I would call a live Q&A. I don't even know if I want to say it's a Q&A, but you demonstrated to the group how you provide value, how you open up a conversation. Miles didn't know you, doesn't really know you or anything about you, and yet, you know, in those 5-10 minutes of what you did, I think that's super valuable to share with people. And I honestly think, you know, there's no one who really does it better than you. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of that story and just what you did, you know, and then we'll kind of recap how people can take what you did there and kind of translate that to their own business or services, or if they want to expand into different regions or areas.
Yeah, of course. So one thing I learned at a very young age, my first marketing job, was ask a lot of questions, right? And if you give people the opportunity to talk about themselves, they'll talk about themselves, right? Because that's where people feel comfortable because it's their story, right? And so, you know, that with that day, that's exactly what I did. First of all, you know, I think curiosity is the key word here, because if you remain curious about the person and about your career trajectory and everything in the world, then there's always something to learn, and there's a space for growth, and you can evolve, right? And I think, that day I just, I got into it. I'm like, I have no idea what fencing, like what's involved in fencing, right?
I didn't even know he was a fencing athlete. He's just an absolute giant. So
Yeah.
you would assume, he maybe played in the NBA, or, he didn't look like he had enough weight on him to be an offensive lineman, but he was huge, I mean, like he had to have been 6'8" or so.
Right. And we know he's at the Red Bull Center, so we know he's an athlete of some sort, right? And
I figured he wasn't a skateboarder. He's way too big.
Exactly. And I'm really always, understanding of my environment too, right? Like I place myself in certain places knowing who I want to train, right? And so we're at the Red Bull facility. I know those are Red Bull athletes, but do I know specifically about him and his fencing? Absolutely not. And I think in those 5 to 10 minutes, I just, basically unveiled like what his day-to-day is, and then what a competition day looks like for him. And so what a competition day looks like for him is completely different than like an NBA player.
It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, like he has to get into like game mode, like game face mode, do his thing, and then sit and wait for 4 hours.
Yeah, I mean, he has to activate and then decompress and then reactivate and then decompress and then reactivate.
And so by doing that, when we talked to him and he told us all of this, all of a sudden, like my brain obviously goes to Joga and what we're going to do to like in between those spaces. But that's quantifying, right? Like that's how you get better, right, at programming for your end user, right? If they're if I didn't know about Miles, right, and I just came in with my own idea of what I think Miles needed, that it wouldn't work, right? And so it's this constant like dance, and it's this constant like not only having that opportunity for them to open up and trust is a huge thing with athletes, right?
Yeah.
But it's also then having or providing solutions, right? And the only way you can provide solutions is by trial and error. Had I had that conversation with Miles 12 years ago, could I help him? Probably not, because I didn't know what I was doing, right?
Right.
So,
but you quickly provided value. And I mean, you could see on his face even that he was surprised how someone who knew nothing about fencing or nothing about, the cadence of his competition or the length of his competition, you could see in his face, he was like, wow, like she really gets what I'm going to need right off the bat.
Right. And and with athletes, it's everything, right? Like there's that thing there and that relationship thing there. And then once you've got the buy-in, then you're good.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, we're kind of getting here to the end. I definitely want to leave some opportunity for questions, but Jen, I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing with just people out there, are there things that you do every day or, mentors? I know you've mentioned some here or there, but I mean, you've been really successful since you've shut down the Joga house. You've definitely talked about how you don't want to battle too much. And if you're battling too much, maybe it's not the right space for you. But let's be honest, it hasn't been just success after success. There's been failures that you've had to overcome. There's been instances where you have, let's say it could have been perceived by an outside person that you didn't show up for things or something like that very early on, even though they were out of your control. Yeah. But like, what do you do to get past that? We kind of have that be your best self slide or so, how do you just keep yourself going, Jana? Like, how do you, keep your positivity, staying motivated, you miss that opportunity in the owner's suite, you know what I mean? But like, that wasn't the end of it. You know what I mean? Like, so maybe just share like some of the things that you do, just which really makes you mentally strong and just keeps you going. And, some of those things, I mean, we've all been in quarantine and it's kind of a weird time for everybody. So, that stuff's always really well received.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I do, and this is something I did learn from my yoga practice in Japan, is I meditate every day. And by just, closing my eyes and doing breathing and meditation, it really helps me identify, what my drivers are. And I think that's really important to find out for yourself. It goes back again to figuring out your authentic self and what gets that fire in your belly. It's different for everybody. And, unfortunately, and I do a TED Talk talk about this, but about social media, is that if you're trying to be somebody else or do something that somebody else is doing, right, it didn't come from your brain. It didn't come from your belly. It's not going to work. Right. And so that, you know, it's great to have role models and mentors and things to aspire brands to be like, etc. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to your authentic self and what your drivers are. And the only way that you could figure that out, and just like I did, is trial and error. And again, like, I didn't find this career path until I was 25, 26 years old, or 27 years old, right? So I was doing all these other things prior to. So I think, you know, there is no right way, right? I just think, like, when you wake up every single day, you just need to be honest with yourself and ask the questions, right? Is this really, you know, if you could freeze frame a picture in your brain of what your life should look like or be like, or what you want to feel like in your life, is that what you're doing today, right? And if it's not, then, you know, there's this whole thing in my slide about taking risk and being fearless, right? Like, it's your. And, you know, I'll bring this up.
You've been fearless at certain points. I mean, I don't know, Jana, if I would have made that phone call to that owner and pushed your way back in because you were stuck on the boat and the game times, you know what I mean? Like, when everything was said and done, I mean, you really, you know, that was really just kind of being fearless, just sucking it all up. And I mean, I understand why you did it. You were probably, at that point, you're probably like, well, I can do this or I can do nothing. And to be honest with you, if I do nothing, it's not going to be worse than doing this.
That's right. Yeah.
But nevertheless, Jana, like, you know, I mean, it was risky. It was fearless. But when everything was said and done, you benefited.
Yeah, I benefit, and again, I put myself out there, right? And I think, you know, I'm just like everybody else. I've got fears, and, you know, I'm not as confident as I could be all the time, and I'm scared of being judged. But, like, you know, I always say, like, people are like, "Oh, how did you get successful?" And I was like, "Well, I was basically like a stalker. Like, I just, like, you know, like, I waited. I found out. I was like, okay, if I want to, like, train the Toronto Maple Leafs, or, like, I'm in Toronto or the Blue Jays, like, where do I find these athletes? Like, how do I get to them, right?" And so I just found out that they were training at this hotel, and I just, like, sat in the lobby and, like, waited and talked to them. And, like, I just put myself, like, in the story you're talking about. I wanted to meet the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs because I thought, oh, that's how I need to get the job, right? And so I showed up at an event that he was at and gave him my business card and had a coffee, and he invited me to a game, and I missed the game, like, because
you're stuck out on the boat.
Because I'm on a yacht. I'm, like, new to Toronto, and friends invited me to go on a yacht. So I said yes. And then I missed the whole thing, like this. And I was like, oh my gosh, how do I make this up? And then I flew to Las Vegas, right, to make it up. And so, did I really know what I was doing? No, but I just knew that I had to put myself out there to do something different and unique, right? And so, and it's scary. Of course it's scary, right? And of course, you know, there's been lots of sacrifice, right? You know, I'm a single mom, and, like, I've missed a lot of my child's life, right? And, you know, and then, you know, I have to bring this up. 4 years ago, I was almost killed, and I have my life now. And so I got a second chance. And so, and I think a lot of people probably listening to this have been through adversity, and especially now with COVID, right? Like, when you get these second chances, or where you hear something and you're like, that inspires me, or that, like, those are signs, you know what I mean? Like, you know, get her going, right? Like, and I think because my life was almost taken from me, that I have this idea now that, you know what, we actually only have one kick at the can, right? Like, why not be happy every day, or be the best, or be as positive as you can for that day? Like, why not just think of something completely crazy that you think you want to do and just go for it? Like, why not? Why not? Yeah, why not?
Well, we've talked a lot about Joga today. We've talked a lot about the workout, but I wanted to share with everybody that you won't only hear about Joga, but actually have the opportunity to experience it. So we are going to have another opportunity here on December 8th to experience the Joga workout live with Jana, led by Jana. And if you guys are interested in getting certified in Joga, you guys have an upcoming training. And because you are a NASM follower, you get a discount. And so we've got that up there right now. I'm sure there'll be more information about the training on the Joga website.
Yeah, everything.
Fantastic. We're really running out of time, but I do want to see if there are any other questions, or if we can answer any questions there. As they kind of pop up, Jen, I'll read them to you.
Sure.
Let me just take Greg a minute. They want to know, do you need to be certified personal trainer or certified in anything or yoga before you come to Joga?
We recommend it. Yeah, absolutely. Because there is, and this is where this, this is awesome because anybody that's come through, NASM to our course,
Right.
like it's awesome because like the
similar language
and whatever. So we do
concepts.
highly, because otherwise, if I don't say that, you could come and learn from me for the 4 days, but you're not going to get as much of it because there's so much kinesiology, there's so much science. So definitely you want to have some sort of foundation before coming in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's intense. The training's really, really intense. It's very specific.
Yeah.
And you're going to move a lot.
Yes.
Oh, just people wanting to know how to get specialized in Joga. I would say go to thejogaworld.com.
Yeah, come to Joga World
to find out more information. You guys are doing virtual trainings now.
Yeah,
which is awesome.
We're doing it in January every Wednesday because before we used to do 4-day intensives, and
right, that's what I got to go to.
Yeah, which is awesome too. We'll put one of those in the calendar for next year as well. But this way it's once a week, and then because it's a lot of information, as you know, so it gives the people a chance to digest information before coming back the next week, right?
I know I wasn't doing my homework at night because it was too much homework for me to do in one night.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that pretty much wraps it up. And a lot of people were asking those same questions. So a lot of people interested in learning more about Joga or getting more experience. So I do invite you guys to come back to NASM Live on December 8th to experience the workout with Jana. But I do encourage all of you guys to get certified. You will learn a ton. You will get stronger. You will know where your weaknesses are, and you will be better.
Yes, I laugh with them.
Everybody. I mean, the first thing the S&Cs always say about Joga training. What was your first impression? It was a lot harder than I expected. I am hurting.
Yeah.
And it's not hurting in a bad way, you guys, but like she says, she really fires up those intrinsic stabilizers. So you start to feel things you hadn't felt for a while.
Exactly. Yeah. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Jana, for coming on today. I can't wait for next week.
Yeah, me too.
It's December 8th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Arizona time for a live Joga session with Jana.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Everyone have a great day.